Hi, I'm Joanie Zeier Poole. We're here at AQS QuiltWeek, Grand Rapids 2016. I've been here teaching all week students to use a regular home sewing machine to do free motion quilting. I would like to introduce my special exhibit, Elegance in Stitches, 25 quilts that I have quilted on a regular home sewing machine. First of all, I'd like you to see Ode to Diane, made in 2000. I was able to take a 3-day seminar with Diane Gaudinsky in Madison, Wisconsin, where I'm from, and she taught us to use the domestic sewing machine for all types of free motion quilting. I worked with basket blocks that Diane designed and pieced those into a quilt top. And then I created original quilting designs for all of the spaces within the top. The design here in these setting triangles is repeated on the baskets, in the sashing, as well as on the borders. This 68 by 80 inch quilt, titled Treasures of Julia's Life, was created in 2002. It was one of the first quilts that I used to enter AQS contests to start being able to get my name out to have a career in quilting. I chose this floral fabric, which I have just quilted in the center of this panel, but then on my corners I use the technique broidery purse, which is to cut out motifs, fashion them into a bouquet, and then applique them to the quilt top. This has areas for lots of original quilting designs on the solid fabrics. And my first time I used the checkerboard pattern was on this quilt around all of these motifs that are representational of my grandmother, who was Julia. Julia had a very strong faith, so I have an image of the Bible. She was married to Martin for 50 years, so I have interlocking hearts with an M and a J. Over here, I've represented her love of music through this lyre. And then there are 9 small hearts here that represent the children born of their union. I've also included her initials up here and my initials down here. In 2003, I created this quilt to have and to hold. I had a really large stash of fabrics that were rather romantic, and so I wanted to create a piece that would be very romantic. And where did I learn about romance but from the stories I had heard from my parents? And so I started drawing images, and I will tell you a little bit about the story that I heard from them. My dad and Mom met at a dance, and they fell in love and were engaged, but then separated by the Second World War. And we used to hear about love letters that were sent across the ocean. And so I have these 2 lovebirds holding an envelope representing the love letters that they sent. I put a yellow ribbon on this bouquet to show her dedication to him and her hope for his safe return. He did come home, a little battered, but he came home, and they were married in a chapel that was called St. Mary of the Lake, and it was very similar to this piece that I've appliqued on the quilt. My mother was wearing a white gown that didn't have any lace, and it did have satin-covered buttons down the front of the dress. And I've represented those buttons by these little stitched dots that are on the edge of the quilt. And then when you step back and you look at the entire quilt, the border is actually sort of a double border, and it was created by looking at some antique lace that was made in Switzerland in the 1600s. I have replicated the photograph I had of the lace by appliquing and quilting in texture. And with this piece, it was the second time I used that signature checkerboard design as I did in my earlier Treasures of Julia's Life quilt. I've added my initials up here, and I've added a small cartouche for the date on the lower area of the quilt. This is my quilt made in 2005, Fée de Beau Rêve, which translates from French into English as Sweet Dreams. It was created when my son was studying at the Sorbonne in Paris, and I would email him late at night and say sweet dreams. And finally I asked him, well, how do they say that in French? And so he told me the term, and I have written that here on an Eiffel Tower, Fait de beau rêve. It also has a lovebird over here delivering an email message. This again is the broidery purse technique, although I did this by machine rather than by hand, where I have cut out fabrics and placed them into this design. I actually fused them to the fabric, and then I finished off all the edges with 3 rounds of very tiny zigzag stitch using invisible thread. There's another applique technique on this also, where I have turned edge images interspersed with the broidery purse or the fused images all around this border treatment. I'm also replicating some of those same flowers that are in the applique in plain quilting on my designs. This piece also has a basket weave technique that I created for this quilt, which uses a grid that is at a 45-degree angle to the edge of the quilt, and I've connected 3 of those squares to make rectangles, and when I put 4 of those rectangles together and stipple the one that's left in the center, it gives you this very dense texture of a basket weave. This is Lee's Choice, 81 by 81 inches, created in 2007. I have had the pleasure of being involved with the same quilting group in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin for over 40 years. We're the Prairie Heritage Quilters, and we put on our own show in Sun Prairie. Having been associated with the group for such a long time, obviously some of our gals have passed away. And Lee was one of the lively members in our group, and after she was gone, her husband brought her books to our class and allowed us to go through them and purchase them. And I found one that was a book of applique from the first half of the 20th century, and they were quilts with appliqued centers. In the book, I found a beautiful piece that had an applique center like this. There was not a pattern for it, so I had to draft my own pattern, but it looked like this circular applique inside of the square applique, and then the ribbon work around the edges. And Lee had left a solid piece of paper marking that quilt, and I just thought she was saying somebody ought to do something special with this quilt. And I agreed, so I named the quilt Lee's Choice. As I was doing all that applique, I decided to add the yellow ribbons that will represent all of the gals that we have had in the group that are gone. And the pink circle represents all the friendships that I've made through machine quilting. When it was time for me to create quilting designs that would fill the large areas of the quilt as well as the border, I went to a party that was hosted by the granddaughter of one of our former members, and she used silverware that had been her grandmother's. So I asked if I could borrow a piece of the silverware, copied it, and created quilting designs that replicated exactly what Gladys's silverware was. And then the final thing was I had done a new background texture on this piece, and that was this lattice. And when I finished it, my son said, it looks rather empty, and I did not have the little leaves in each one of the spaces at the time. And so I thought about it, and I decided since I had a floral theme going, I would add a leaf in each one of these spaces, which I always tell my students are for them, because I hope they'll turn over a new leaf after they learn what I can teach them about machine quilting. And the quilting designs that I created from that silverware pattern to fill all the different areas of this quilt are available to purchase from my website, heirloomquiltingdesigns.com. They are the Prairie Rose Quilting Design Collection. I'm standing between 2 quilts, Embroidered Elegance 1, Embroidered Elegance 2. These are about my only attempt of ever using an embroidery module for my domestic sewing machine. With this piece, one solid green piece of fabric was embroidered with the large floral design in the center, and then identical fabric was used to create 4 of these side panels, which were embroidered in the embroidery hoop and then appliqued on top. Again, a little bit more embroidery applique here, here, and on the outside detail. And then when it was time to quilt, I actually replicated the exact same shapes that I had embroidered and put them on the border on the outside of the quilt with just machine quilting with a very heavily stippled background that allowed those designs to pop. Embroidered Elegance 2 is a series of embroidered shapes that were actually used as appliques on the quilt also. So I started with embroidered piece in the center, and I layered on the top with a little bit of hand embroidered detail around the edges of my shapes as I appliqued them to larger pieces and built the design working out. You will see the same shapes quilted here that are also used in the embroidery out here. All of these areas with the texture would have been marked on the quilt, and then I follow that line when I'm stitching using hand-guided refined free motion quilting. These are all original designs that I've used on the piece to fill all the different areas of the quilt. This is folk art meets free motion, 82 inches of domestic freedom. When I created this piece, I knew that when I entered it in a show, many people wouldn't realize that this size piece, 82 inches, was even possible to stitch on a regular home sewing machine. Well, it was entered here first at AQS QuiltWeek Grand Rapids in 2014 and was awarded the Best Home Machine Quilting. It was originally started when I was a hand quilter, and the top was set away in the basement for about 15 years, and I dragged it back out and I completed the top and transformed what was a folk art looking piece into much more elegant look with the machine quilting. I've created the same quilting motifs in different areas of the quilt and created setting triangles here in the corner as well as on the sides, and then a block design, and repeated those shapes in my little corner motifs, and even some of the little these little details are continued in all different places around the quilt. This fabric here is actually had a grid printed on it, and I've stitched just what the manufacturer printed. Got some real nice detail again along the outside of the quilt using that grid, and I've added the little tiny leaves that I've used in these patterns as a linear detail along the edge of the quilt. I added my initials and the date along the bottom edge of the piece just to identify my work for all the years to come. This is Doodle Bird 2. It is the third piece that I did with a friend of mine, Pam Levenhagen, who is a painter. Pam had created a small painting of this design back in about 1998. And we blew up the design, and she started painting the center of this piece on a solid white piece of fabric. Pam and I then handed the quilt back and forth as I layered it and started stitching it. She would add more paint and back and forth as we went on that. Pam has never created a quilt, but she sure has pushed me to be a more creative quilter by adding all sorts of unusual little spaces that I had to determine how I was going to fill with quilting that would evenly be dispersed over the entire quilt. Well, I'm ending the tour here with the last quilt that I ever hand quilted in 1999. It's been my pleasure to have you join me here at AQS Quilt Week, Grand Rapids 2016 to see my exhibit, Elegance and Stitches. Everything else was done on a regular home sewing machine. You can learn lots more information about my classes, more stories about quilts, all sorts of tips on my website, heirloomquiltingdesigns.com. Again, it's Joanie. Thank you very much for joining me.